Hello everyone, welcome back to our 5-minute Bible study series. Today we are in Joshua chapter 11. If you want the free PDF, you can download it on our website, tobelikechrist.com. Okay, when did the events of Joshua chapter 11 take place? Well, the Israelites began their conquest of Canaan, conquest of the Promised Land, approximately 1450 BC. That's a rough estimate. And that conquest lasted approximately 5 to 7 years. All right, so let's talk about our characters. Who are the main characters in this chapter? First, we've got the Israelites. We've got Joshua, who's the leader of the Israelites. We've got a new character who we're going to talk about, Jabin. Jabin is the king of Hazor, and he gathered a large military force to fight against the Israelites in the north of the Promised Land. So we'll talk more about him in a second. Okay, move down to our map. Now, in Joshua 10, Joshua led this large military campaign through the southern part of Canaan. In Joshua 11, Israel fought with a bunch of kings in the north of the Promised Land, a place called the Waters of Merom. And you can see Merom almost all the way to the top of the map there, west of Lake Hula. All right, that brings us to our outline. First section in this chapter, the first 15 verses, I've entitled it, Israel Defeats the Alliance of Hazor. So Jabin, that guy who we just talked about, he was the king of Hazor. He heard about the Israelites' conquest of the southern part of the Promised Land, and he got worried. He organized a huge alliance between himself and several of the remaining kings in the region, and they brought, quote, a great horde of warriors, chariots, and horses to fight against Israel at the Waters of Merom. Now, God spoke with Joshua, and he assured him that he was going to give him the victory, so there was no reason to fear this great horde of people who were coming against the Israelite people. The warriors of Israel launched a sudden attack on Hazor's alliance and overcame them. We're told that the alliance retreated, but Joshua chased them and, quote, left none remaining. Joshua and his men hamstrung the horses of this alliance and burned their chariots. Now, if you hamstring a horse, it can't run anymore, at least that's my understanding. It's not able to run, so these horses can't be used in battle again. So this would restrict any of their enemies from ever using these horses to try to mount another attack. So they did that, burned their chariots. After defeating the alliance, the Israelite army conquered all of the cities of the kings who were part of that alliance. So they met them in Merom, fought against them, defeated them, then they went around all their cities and took control of those. The inhabitants of the cities were killed, and the spoil was shared amongst the Israelites. So that is the first 15 verses of the chapter. So then the second section, verses 16 through 23, I've just entitled it, The Continued Conquest of Canaan. So God hardened the hearts of the remaining kings in the region, and they made war with Israel. Right? They weren't smart enough to run away and realize they weren't going to win. God hardened their hearts. They made war against Joshua. And the text says that, quote, Joshua made war a long time with those kings. Chapter 11, verse 18. No one made peace with the Israelites except, do you remember who? The Gibeonites, who we talked about in Joshua chapter 9. They kind of deceived the Israelites into thinking that they weren't from the Promised Land. They lived far off, right? And then they made that pact with them. All the inhabitants of the land were killed, including the Anakim, which were very strong people who lived in the hill country. And then finally, we're told that Joshua, quote, took the whole land, verse 23, and divided it between the tribes of Israel. And we're going to talk about that in more detail in the upcoming chapters. For our application today, this is actually an application that I made a shorter video on, so if you stay up to date with the YouTube Shorts or my Instagram Reels, you've probably already heard this application, but let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. Many people suggest that the God of the Old Testament is different from the loving, patient, gracious God of the New Testament because he did things like command the Israelites to kill the, quote, innocent inhabitants of the land of Canaan. We examined this idea back in the book of Deuteronomy, but I think it's worth revisiting here because you hear this criticism of God and of the Bible quite often. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, and other passages make it clear that the inhabitants of the land of Canaan were not these innocent people who were being terrorized by the Israelites, but rather they were really wicked people. They were doing things like sacrificing their own children. And we've already been told back in verses like Genesis 15, verse 16, that God had showed them patience for many years. But his patience had a limit. It wore out, and he brought the Israelites into their land to execute his judgment on them for their wickedness. So those who try to frame Israel's conquest of Canaan as this like heartless genocide of the land's innocent inhabitants, they're either ignorant of the scriptures or they're not being honest with the scriptures, and they're misrepresenting what's actually going on. So the next time you hear that criticism, you might want to say, hey, yeah, that's not exactly accurate, right? Because I've heard it a bunch. And I think this is also a good lesson as to why we need to read the larger story of the Old Testament. This is why we need to go through it chapter by chapter, right? Because if you just, plop into this chapter and somebody just presents this text to you and you don't know the surrounding context, well, maybe you walk away thinking that their criticism is valid. But if you know the story of the Old Testament, the context that surrounds this chapter, then you'll know that we need to look at this a little bit more closely before anyone starts criticizing the character of God.